The later stages of Animus development begin with this image of man as hero. The heroic man is admired for his strength, his courage, and his competence. He is essentially an ideal. I haven't met any real knights in shining armor in this life, but it's an ideal, you know. They're not really human. They're idealized kind of archetypes. They are a pillar of strength and virtue, characterized by rationality, justice, compassion, and sensitivity. He appears in mythology as the knight in shining armor who rides in on the proverbial white horse to her rescue, and as Prince Charming, who carries her off to his kingdom to live happily ever after. Here he is in modern day form. And of course, Luke Skywalker, the hero of our time, Joseph Campbell, you know, who wrote The Hero with 1,000 Faces, assisted in the development of the Star Wars movies. He is the model of the man a woman at this stage would like to marry. However, the heroic Animus may not represent itself as an external man for some women. Instead, it may be manifested as a desire to accomplish goals in the world of men, such as earning a higher educational degree or fighting for social justice. If she projects this image onto a flesh and blood man, he often shows up in the form of a professor, this is Dr. Jung. Here's one of my favorite professors. Anybody know who this is? David Foster Wallace. Not with us anymore, but I love him. He can also present as a clergyman, a religious leader, not God himself, but he also presents often as a physician, a healer. These doctor shows are really, really popular. Remember this guy? Hawkeye? This is where George Clooney first got his start. ER, I think. Mm-hmm. Or also, lawyers get these projections sometimes. Here's the best lawyer, in my humble opinion. And of course, I couldn't resist this. The most fit president we probably ever had, contrary to news reports. As long as he can carry the projection, and he usually can at this kind of distance, right? All is well, but as you might imagine, successful projection is short-lived, especially if we're in any kind of close relationship to the man. Then the disparity between the image and the image bearer is all too obvious. Emma Jung wrote, an archetype such as the Animus represents will never really coincide with the individual man. The less so, the more individual a man is. Individuality is really the opposite of the archetype. For what is individual is not in any way typical. Archetypal means, archaic and typical. This is where we see the patterns. If a person is archetypally possessed, we see patterns. in their personality, and that's where we get a diagnostic manual, right? So once a woman has discovered the discrepancy between her projection and the actual man that she's with, she's likely to feel great confusion and disappointment, and may even accuse him of changing into someone she doesn't even know anymore, or bemoan that you are not the man I married. She may try to force him to conform to her heroic image, which tends to constellate an anima response in him, producing a vicious cycle very difficult to break. Of this situation, Jung says, it is a dialogue which, irrespective of its participants, is repeated millions and millions of times in all the languages of the world and always remains essentially the same. For, he says, when anima and animus meet, the animus draws his sword of power, and the anima ejects her poison of illusion and seduction. For no man can converse with an animus for 5 minutes without becoming a victim of his own anima. This forms one of the worst complications in the relations between men and women. And much of this familiar scenario was constellating in Audrey's relationship to her husband. She had a lot of disappointment and a lot of pain, and as you might imagine, we talked about this a lot. The miracle is that she began, by virtue of examining her dreams and her neuroses, to see that much of the reality of this dynamic was within her. Her own internal situation led her into this unhappy marriage and into other unsatisfactory relationships. But especially the relationship within herself was unsatisfactory. Since the inner contrasexual image determines psychic equilibrium, everyone is the bearer of an intrapsychic image of the other sex. Unless a relationship is established with it, one suffers throughout life, and it is as though one's possibilities are reduced by half. As Audrey gradually became more and more aware of its presence within her, the image began to change, and she had the following dream. A young man gets into the back seat with me, she's in a car, with a machine gun. I'm very afraid. Then I grab the machine gun, and I realize it doesn't even work. So I push him out of the car. As she became increasingly attentive to her inner world, we begin to see here the development of competence and agency, aggression and anger. In proportion to the extent a woman has repressed and projected her heroic animus, she will have feelings of resentment and rage at having been, quote, denied the right to experience her own competence. This often constellates some understandable fear of her own rage and aggression. However, to discover her own heroism, and not just this guy's, right? And to move forward, she will have to reconnect with her legitimate anger. Legitimate, natural, neutral, it's there. Otherwise, she will have to continue to project her hero and will remain in the role of mediator or muse, and her self-worth will depend on her ability to inspire and support creative, thoughtful men around her. We can understand her depression as the weight of her own potential development, which she has projected onto others and denied in herself. She is exhausted by her perfectionism and the unending cycle of self-criticism and guilt. She also had grief at this time about lost time and opportunities, which she also had to embrace and experience in analysis. At this stage, though, she must finally come to claim her feminine power as beautiful, worthwhile, good, and true. She must come to see her contribution to culture and society as valuable in whatever feminine form it has taken. It may be in the bringing forth and caring of children, or her ability to provide warmth, kindness, empathy, and relatedness in her work and in her relationships, or in her ability to create and bring beauty and art into the world. Through this kind of self-regard, she is finally able to form a partnership with men and with her Animus, knowing that she has something worthwhile to offer. The resolution of the heroic stage is the realization that men are just male persons without magic power or authority because they are endowed with penises. With this knowledge, she no longer seeks primarily to emulate men, nor to be approved by them. The end of this stage is signaled by the end of Audrey's embittered servitude. She begins to make her own choices about when and how to give herself to others. She is no longer completely bound up by the expectations and needs of others. She began to realize that her first responsibility is herself and taking care of her own body and her own needs. She experienced relief and joy in the simple pleasure of making her own decisions about how she would spend her day, when she would or would not entertain people for dinner, how she would celebrate holidays. This new reservoir of creativity and freedom from internalized inferiority marked the beginning of the next stage. And this stage is called Animus as partner within, or the restoration of authority. At this point, according to Jung and Polly Eisendroth, it must be acknowledged that this next stage represents an advanced and therefore rare development in a woman. Quite rare. But I believe it's possible for anyone truly seeking to live her own life to fully experience the gift of consciousness, which is really what we're all doing here, right? This stage involves a conscious confrontation with what it means to be a woman in a patriarchal world. Becoming aware of these conditions is no small task. As we become aware of how we have been unconsciously molded and twisted by the collective culture, we must confront the feelings of violation, denigration, rage, and only then can we begin to understand our life's experience, which has overall put us into a double bind. We are expected, for example, to be caring, empathic, and sustaining as women and mothers, but on the other hand, we are plagued by servility, passivity, and low self-esteem for work that is continuously devalued by society. The impossible situation of having responsibility for the care of others while having no corresponding power or not enough corresponding power is crazy making. And it carries the danger of collapsing a woman into despair and bitterness. The key is this: if a woman can see her cultural and familial situation clearly and realistically, and then if she can do something about it, she has internalized the Animus complex as the partner within. In this psychic space, she has a new and different sense of increased responsibility. That is, she recognizes that she herself has unconsciously orchestrated her own experience in life. She realized that she herself has cooperated with the denigration of the feminine by adopting the values of patriarchy. With this comes a sense of authority to state her own truths. She does not disown her shameful, doubting, aggressive, or hostile feelings, but they no longer overwhelm her or send her into frantic defenses. She no longer needs to find men who will act out her rage and aggression, or at least less compelled to do that, because it has come home to her. She can now recognize, process, and use her anger legitimately. She does not have to project it out onto the closest man and then condemn him for it. She is therefore less anxious because she has learned to discriminate between her own authority and others. She is no longer, or at least less often, she no longer takes the criticism of others to be a catastrophic indictment on her personhood. Her identity is no longer bound to the inferior status of the female gender in this world, nor to the confinement of a particular role such as wife or mother. At this point, she recognizes and honors her limitations and compensates for her vulnerabilities through increased awareness and confidence in herself. Miracle of miracles, and to her immense relief, she realizes that she cannot perform all her roles equally well. She must give up crippling perfection once and for all, though also over and over, renouncing the unattainable and all the guilt that goes with it. Coming from her own individual psyche, she makes decisions that fit with her own strengths and limitations. This is a new place. She looks for help and asks for it when she needs it. And she stops trying to be all things to all people, especially her kids, if she's a mom, which Audrey was. And this she essentially radically renounces the patriarchal ideal of motherhood, where there are no boundaries between herself and others, and where she must always be available for others' needs. This may prevent her from being blamed for overprotectiveness or engulfment, but then it may expose her to accusations of abandonment, neglect, or that dreaded word, self-indulgence. I guess the take-home message here is, as Jung said, choose your sin and then sin boldly. To sum up, then, there is a self-chosen descent into the depths. By this I mean there is a conscious decision to examine one's inner world, such as choosing to begin an analysis. This is followed by a confrontation with aggressive and necessarily deformed aspects of repressed female power. She must recognize her rage and hatred and how it has affected her choices and actions and take responsibility for it. Finally, there is a gradual freeing of energy previously invested in the complex. Energy previously used to judge or change others is now available for inner work. I believe that there is a need here also at this point for a personal spiritual practice to channel this energy and to integrate this inner work. This is Blake's image of the union of the masculine and feminine. Jung called it the conjunctio within. So this can take the form of contemplative retreat, solitude, body work, yoga, or whatever it is that floats your boat and feels resonant with your own individual soul. At this stage, Melanie dreamed the final following dream. I am with my daughter and grandson, the young Animus. He is about 3 months old. Suddenly, he begins to talk in complete sentences, and he starts walking around. I'm shocked and amazed. I feel this is not normal, because it isn't. It's divine. The dream of an extraordinary or divine child symbolizes a woman's ability to transcend the merely personal or social conditions of her life and to begin to understand the experience of the archetypal realm. Another dream image at this stage is often a wedding or a sacred or divine marriage like this one. In this we see an image of wholeness, the joining of opposites, our own divine nature revealed in our humanness. This is the part of the story which in fairy tales is symbolized by the transformation of Beauty's Beast into the handsome prince, by Cinderella finally marrying her hero, by Sleeping Beauty being awakened by the kiss of her champion. The function of the Animus at this point is as a bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. He is the go-between, he who mediates opposites, who connects us with our divinity. Without him, we cannot know our power nor our true nature. We cannot have choices and we cannot experience freedom. So I want to close by again quoting Emma Jung, who many probably don't realize was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, wisdom, courage, and tolerance. To discriminate between oneself and the animus and sharply to limit its sphere of power is extraordinarily important. Only by doing so is it possible to free oneself from the fateful consequences of identifying with the animus and being possessed by it. Hand in hand with the discrimination goes the growth of consciousness and the realization of the true self. When women succeed in maintaining themselves against the animus, instead of allowing themselves to be devoured by it, then it ceases to be only a danger and becomes a creative power. We women need this power. For strange as it seems, only when this masculine entity becomes an integrated part of the soul and carries on its proper function, there is it possible for a woman to be truly a woman in the higher sense, and at the same time also being herself to fulfill her individual human destiny. Thank you.